Hey everyone, this is Dylan of Harmonic Design, and we're going to be live coding a commenting system, a system that we can kind of integrate into any kind of site or CMS. I'll probably end up making a second part to this video where I'll convert this plugin into a WordPress plugin. So since pretty much every plugin I have is prefixed with HD for Harmonic Design, I guess we'll call this one HDComments. We'll just get right into it. So I haven't really thought this out or planned it out as far as design or layout or even really functionality. So we'll be kind of figuring out as we go and figuring out the best way to code certain features, what features we need, what fields we need, how we want to arrange them. We'll be figuring that out as we go. But we're not going to be using Vue. We're not going to be using React. We're not going to be using any kind of CSS preprocessor. We're not going to be using Babel or anything like that. We're kind of going really native and bare bones. And the reason we're going to be using vanilla JavaScript is basically because it's by far the most performant. It outperforms Vue. It outperforms React. It significantly outperforms jQuery. It's the fastest, most optimized, way to do it. And it's also really compatible and lightweight. Basically, when you load a site that just uses vanilla JavaScript, you don't need to really download any extra libraries. It's just the browser already has it loaded and initiated. So if you're using a site that isn't already using jQuery, like for instance, jQuery comes prepackaged with pretty much every WordPress site. I don't even think it's really possible to have WordPress without jQuery these days. So many plugins and all that require it. But we're not going to be using it simply because we want this to be able to work not just in WordPress, but any other kind of site as well. So the first thing we need is, I guess we'll need a index.html. We'll need a style sheet, and we'll need our primary script file. So basically, in Ubuntu, you can have things called templates. So I automatically created these, and they're already pre-filled with certain information. But we'll be changing and editing that. So let's open this up in code, or Visual Studio Code. So here we are, we have it open. So we have index, the JavaScript, and the CSS file. So let's open up the index file. So once again, this is based off of my default template I use for HTML files just to help me get started and clean things up. But we don't need a lot of this. We're going to be keeping the main HTML document, kind of like the body and the head and all that, simply so that we can actually display and view what the commenting system looks like somewhat on a real life site. But really, we won't have that. We don't need that. We want to keep this kind of bare bones. I guess we'll keep, this is pretty much what we'll have. So we will be loading our script file, and we'll want to basically wrap everything inside a div. So we'll call it div ID equals HD comments. So basically everything inside of here is going to be the actual commenting system. The rest is just to help us develop in style. In fact, if you want to make it even easier, we can actually put the style sheet included down here as well. So basically, when we actually kind of deploy this on a site, this is what we're deploying here. The rest will actually be already part of your site. Next, let's go over to the JavaScript file. So once again, in my default template, we kind of got a console log wrapped inside of a jQuery ready function, but we don't need that. We're not going to be using jQuery. We're using just good old vanilla. So let's get rid of that and make this called, HD comments init. That way we can just easily see, when we load up the HTML, we can see that yes, the script's actually connected, and we can start doing like timer functions, stuff like that, if we ended up wanting to fine tune performance that much. Just reformat that a bit nicer. And now we got the style sheet. So once again, this is the kind of my default style sheet, but as you can see, we're doing stuff on the HTML document, and we're selecting every attribute here, which is really not performant. We got stuff in the body. We can delete all this. We're not going to be using any of that. So let's just keep this fairly bare bones. I'm actually going to come. We can delete this, but we're actually going to come back to this all selector in a moment. But let's load up this index file. So here we have the index file here. So as you can see, it's just a blank document because we haven't done anything yet. So the first thing we want to do is we want to kind of style this a little bit better. So remember, everything's going to be inside this div HDComments, but since we, just to help us develop and style, let's actually add a wrapper div. So let's put everything inside of a wrapper div. That way we can do this. Let's do margin 10% top bottom and auto left right. That way this kind of helps position things a bit better. We'll go width 100% and a max width of 800 pixels. Now this would normally be, this kind of wrapper function would be actually controlled by your WordPress theme or your whatever site you're using, but we're just kind of putting this in ourselves just to help us develop and test. So now we're going to want to style the HDComments main div. So this is now where we're actually getting to the HDComments coding. And we're going to want to, let's just give it a small border. Let's go with an E border. And let's give it some padding. I like white space. White space is great for design. So let's give it a 40 pixel padding. So now if we go back to the HTML document, we'll actually get to see something. Or not. Let's load up. So there's the wrapper. And why aren't we seeing... So did I spell HDComments wrong? Oh, I did. I put HDComments. That's stupid. Okay. Comments. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay. Helps if I actually write down the name of the correct div. So as you can see, so we got the wrapper div here that just kind of centers it, makes it a maximum 800 pixels wide. And then we got the actual comments div itself, which is display block naturally. And we gave it a small little border. So basically everything inside this box is where we're going to kind of keep, or we're going to house the HDComments code. So I'm going to get back into this. So the reason I originally had this was I basically install the HTML as box sizing border box. I forgot what it was called for a moment there. Right, so I called it box sizing border box, and then basically I make everything else inherit that. And the reason for that is because it's a bit more performant. But remember, we don't want to override the styles of any of like the main theme or the main site. We only want to override the styles that belong to HDComments. So I'm just going to update this. So there we go. So now only siblings of HDComments will actually get the property of border box. And that's going to come in just really useful when we start putting in inputs and stuff like that. So what's next here? So what do we need? I guess let's put in a title. So let's make it in an H3, which I think is just the kind of natural progression. I mean, generally speaking, the page will have an H1, maybe several H2s, maybe even a couple H3s, but I feel like, you know, this isn't like a super high valued title. It's, you know, an H3 just feels appropriate to me. So we'll call it leave a reply. Right, and just to show you, so now we have the title, leave a reply. So basically, we don't want to style the comments too much because we want it to kind of inherit those styles from your site as much as possible. So if your site has a black background, white text, then we want ours to also mimic that. So I'm not going to be doing things like manually applying font families or font sizes or colors or anything like that, because we want your site to inherit it as much as possible. So you also got to remember that as we build this out, it's actually not going to look as good as it could look here on the dev site because we're not using those custom sizes, fonts, or paddings. But if you were to kind of input this, like copy and paste it on another site that has nice styling, this will inherit those nice styles as well. So we got leave a reply. So I guess now the best way to think about it is every comment section really has, every comment needs two kind of sections. It needs a section for someone to actually write a comment or reply to a comment, and then it needs a section to actually display the comments. So let's actually create divs for each of those sections. So we'll call the first div HDC. So we're going to prefix everything with HDC. That way, in case this site, for instance, already has a div called comments, we're not accidentally selecting that div. By putting a prefix before kind of all of our classes and IDs, we're ensuring that we're only selecting what we actually want to select. So we'll call this HDC create comment. So everything inside of here will basically be the comment form. And then we'll have another div here, and we'll call it ID equals HD. By the way, I noticed I didn't actually put an ID equals in here. That's awkward. There we go. So we'll call this HDC comments. So this is where the actual comments themselves will display. So now we need to think about what fields we actually need when creating a comment. So we need the actual comment itself. So let's create a label. And what should the ID? Well, I guess we'll do HDC. We'll go HDC comment input. Sure, that makes sense. You want to basically you want to label things very specific, so like you can look at the HDC comment input and you kind of know what it's going to be. And we'll make it a text area. What else do we need? We need email, right? We'll call it email input. And this will be a standard input. Actually, it'll be an email input, right? And then we need a nickname, or I guess we'll just call it your name. And it'll just be a regular text input. So there we go. So now we have those kind of 3 inputs. It's going to look really ugly though. Like, let's actually take a look. So that's what it looks like, super ugly. But we got the label, text area, your email, and your name. So let's actually style this a lot nicer. So let's go back to the editor here. So what we want to do is we want to basically give each of these a custom class name. I mean, even though they each have unique IDs and I can just target the ID directly, we want them, it's probably just easier to just have them all have a same and custom class. So we'll call it class equals HDC input. You know what, we're going to want to do the same with the labels as well. So let's give the labels a custom. So the reason why I'm doing this, I could do something like I could target, for instance, HDComments label, and that will basically target and style every single label inside the HDComments div, and that would work very well. The problem is it's not very performant because the way that CSS works is it goes from the right to the left. So if I were to do something like HDComments label and then something in here, what your browser actually does is it first selects every single label on the site, and then it filters out and tries to figure out which labels actually belong to HDComments. So for example, if you have a page with a lot of labels on, that's a lot of extra calculations and filtering that your browser needs to do to figure out, should I style this or not? Whilst if I just use a direct class, then it doesn't need to filter. Instead of just selecting every label and then filtering, it just only selects every element of that class and then styles it. It doesn't need to figure out whether should I or shouldn't I style it. It just styles it. So it's much faster if you actually do direct classes as much as possible. So what do we have? We have HDC underscore label. So we want this to display block. We want to give it a bit of a margin on the bottom, maybe, I don't know, 8 pixels, just to create a bit of spacing and padding. So for instance, if I go back now, we'll see that now this is a full block element. So it'll actually expand the full width, right? And it's now got that 8 pixel padding, or sorry, margin underneath it to create a bit of space between the label and the element. But now we need to style the inputs because those are super ugly. So .hdc inputs. So what do we want here? We want, let's give it a full width, a width 100%. Let's give it some padding. What's a good padding? Maybe we'll go for 12 pixels and 16 pixels. Let's give it a border. What's a good border? Maybe, I don't know, C. So this should now start to look a lot nicer. Still doesn't quite look nice, but it looks a lot nicer. So one thing I want to point out is basically right here is the reason why, or one of the main reasons why we have border box sizing. Without that, if I have the width at 100% here, without that, what we'll see happen is that, see, now it extends too far. It goes past the padding. So in order to avoid that, I would need to basically do something like this. I need to go calc minus 16 pixels to offset the 16 pixels here. That way we don't extend too far. So if I did something like that, this should theoretically, yeah, see, there we go. It's, oh, actually, because of course I need to double it up. Instead of 16, I need to actually double it up to 32 because the padding's on both sides, left and right. So in order to avoid issues and incompatibilities like that, we can just do 100% and have the box sizing in there, and we know that it's never, we know that it's going to be contained and it's going to be sizing the right way. So now we got this somewhat working, but it doesn't really make sense to have the comments here and then underneath email, but underneath we could probably display this in a grid, and also we want to add a bit more rows to this. It's not quite long enough, is it? So let's do the rows first. So we're going to go edit our text area, and we're going to go rows equals, I don't know, 6. So now this is a bit longer and nicer and a bit more, I don't know, a bit more space to type. But what we want to do now is we want to put this into columns. And let's use CSS Grid. This is a great chance to use CSS Grid. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to put these elements here inside a div, and we're going to style it as a grid. So we're going to go div id equals HDC comments. No, I just realized there we go. So HDC comments, what would be a good thing to call this? Comments contact, I guess, because it's really, this is your contact information, right? It's your email and your name. So it's kind of like contact information. I don't know, makes sense to me. So now we got that. And now what we want to do is we want to have this in one column and this in 2 columns. So what I could do is I could actually target pretty much like first element, second element, you know, and be like, you know, span 1, span, or sorry, you know, stuff like that, like span 2 and make these span 2 and make these span 2. But it's probably easier to just put these inside another div, and you'll see why soon. So there we go. So this is the div that we're going to turn into a grid, and we're going to set it into 2 columns. So each element will be its own column, which is why we wrap these inside a div. That way the label doesn't become its own column and the input doesn't become its own column. So let's go and turn that into a grid. So it's actually really easy. We're just going to go display grid. And now we need to set what the grid size is. So it's grid template columns, and we're going to go 1 FR, 1 FR. So what FR means, well, it doesn't actually mean free space, but I mean, think of it as like free space. So for instance, if I was to just do 1 FR, that means it'll expand 100%. 1FR means 50%, 50%, you know, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, or I could do something like, you know, 1/3, 2/3, you know, so it kind of splits it evenly that way, but we want it to be 1FR, 1FR. So what we're going to also need is we're going to need something called a grid gap, and I'm going to show you why. So now we have it in a nice grid. We got left side, right side, it works great, but see how they're still touching? There's no gap. So I mean, I could accomplish that with, for instance, padding, but it's better to use gap in this case. So we're going to go grid, column, gap, and let's do, so our normal padding here is 40 pixels here, so we should probably half that and do 20 pixels. And now we got a nice gap here. But now the problem is that there's not enough room between here. But luckily all of this is inside the one div, so we can actually just add margin to it. Let's do margin top 20 pixels. There we go, that looks a little nicer. You know what, I'm kind of thinking that maybe we should do 40 here as well. Maybe we should make the grid gap 40. Let's test it out. See how that looks. Yeah, you know what, I don't know, that just feels a bit better for the spacing now. But as you can see, we're starting to get an actual form here now. So what else do we need? We need the submit button. We need to submit this. Is there any other, you know what would be, so I want to add in reactions. So basically on my blog, Design by Pixel, I use Discus, and I hate Discus because they do ads. Who knows what they do with personal and private information. They're not GDPR compliant, and worst of all, it slows down your site so much because they freaking load so much JavaScript and scripting and tracking and analytics. It just slows your site down. But one thing that I do like about them is they implemented reactions. So I've been actually using Discus on Design by Pixel for a while now. But the problem is, despite writing what I obviously biasly think are really good articles, very long articles, you know, anywhere from 8 to 15 minute read times, and despite my analytics showing me that people seem to actually be reading the full things, I don't really get a lot of comments. My articles might only get 1 to maybe 5 comments. So as a creator, it's kind of hard for me to judge the value. Are people actually enjoying it? Do they like it? Do they dislike it? Do they have a problem with a certain part of it? Do they like my writing style? I have no idea. But what Discus did is they implemented reactions. So people don't even need to actually comment. They can submit a reaction like, this made me happy, thumbs up, or this made me laugh, or this made me sad. And what I notice is that articles that I would write an article that still only gets 1 or 2 comments on it, but I also get like 20 reactions on it. So it's good for me as a content creator that I actually get to have some kind of feedback. So I think having reactions in any kind of commenting system is a good thing to have. So we'll figure out a way to add reactions. So where should we, so I guess, you know, we'll probably do it this. We'll probably have another grid. So we'll do this grid, I don't know, maybe 2/3, 1/3. So this first box will have the reactions. We'll say like select the reactions. You can select an emoji. And then we'll have the submit button here. Let's go ahead and build something like that. So here's content, and we'll call this next one I don't want to just call it reactions because it also contains the submit button. So let's call it, let's just call it footer. I'm sure there's a better word and I can always rename it later. For now, let's call it footer. And once again, we're going to have 2 divs inside of this because we're still, even though the size of the columns are going to be different, it's still just going to be 2 columns. So this first div is going to be for reactions. Let's actually give this an ID of reactions. HDC comment reactions. And this will be, actually, we don't even need this to be a div because the way grid works, it styles elements. So a div is an element, but you know what else is an element? Just a button. Button's an element. So we actually don't need to wrap this button inside a div. We can just style it directly. Let's give this ID HDC, let's just call it HDC submit. Not submit, submit. And we'll give it a class. We'll give it a class Actually, I'm trying to think whether we'll actually have any other buttons that, I don't even think we actually need any other buttons in the system. I can't think of why we'd, I mean, not a button that would be styled like this one. So we can actually just use the ID to style it directly, since we don't need, you know, we wouldn't lose any performance by doing it that way. So now inside here, we're going to want to have, I guess we'll call it an H4 tag, because it's not quite as important as leave or apply, but we'll call it reactions. And then we'll have, I don't know, some spans where we'll actually put the emoji in. So let's actually figure out what emojis we want. Smile emoji. Actually, you know, let's do a thumbs up. Let's do a thumbs up emoji. So we'll do a thumbs up emoji. We'll do, what else do we need? We need a laugh, right? Oh, that was a funny article. Let's laugh. So do we want rolling on the floor? Well, we're gonna have a sad laugh as well. So the fact that there's tears on these, I don't want to confuse people and think that it might be sad or crying. So let's do the grinning squinty face. What else do we need? We need angry. We need angry emoji. So do we want, that's too angry. That's like hatred. Let's just do this emoji. So we got like, laugh, angry. I guess we need sad. So I guess this one here. Yeah, this is probably the best one. Crying face. And then let's do like love, or like I love this, or heart tits, or I don't think I want to use, I don't want to use an actual heart. I'd rather keep it on the same, like, so it's like they're all the kind of smiley emojis with exception to the thumbs up. So there we go. So now we have emojis. So let's give these each a class so that we can style them a bit easier. And like, once again, I could do something like HDC_comment_reactions span. I could do that to select them all. But the problem is, like I said, it would then select every single span on the page and then kind of go backwards to figure out which span actually belongs to HDC_comment_reactions. By adding a direct class, it's just much better on when the browser actually has to target in Paint. So we'll call this HDC reaction. And we're also going to need a custom data attribute. Data reaction equals. And this is going to be for when we target the reaction with JavaScript. So like when you click on one of these reactions, we're going to want to store what that reaction is in some kind of variable. So we'll call this like, we'll call this laugh, we'll call this angry, we'll call this sad, and we'll call this love. So there we go. So this is going to look really ugly. Get rid of that. So this is going to look ugly. Yeah, so everything's just kind of, because we don't have columns, we don't have any formatting or positioning, we don't have really anything right now. So let's style this out now. So I guess the first thing we're going to want is we're going to want to create the grid. So let's create that grid. So we'll go display equals grid. We'll go grid template columns, and we'll go so the reactions will give as much room as they can, and the emoji, sorry, the submit button, we only kind of, let's put a max width of 80 pixels. So what that means is that it doesn't matter how big or small this gets, we're gonna reserve 80 pixels here, and then the rest is going to be for the reactions. So it doesn't really matter how big. The button's always going to have 80 pixels to work with. Do we even want a grid gap or margin? I don't know yet. Let's see what it looks like after, before we get into that. But actually, let's actually show you what it looks like. So now we actually got, you know, 2 columns here. One thing you can see is that the button's kind of fitting 100% of the height and all that, and we'll get into fixing that in a bit. But right now, let's get rid of it. See, the problem is this is an H4 element, which means it's a block element, which means it's expanding the full width of the first column. So we don't want that. We want it to be an inline block. That way it goes to the left of the emojis. So let's give this a custom style as well. So we'll call it, actually we'll give it an ID. HDC reaction title. This way we can style it directly. So we'll see now that it's actually lined up a bit better. So one thing we want to do is, because this entire row is going to be kind of, it's not like this row where it's like we got a label and a text box in the row, like each of these columns is the same height. See that? See how each column's the same height? For us, each column's the same height here, so that's the way grid works, but you'll notice that it's kind of weirdly positioned and how like the emojis aren't really centered right, and the submit button's going like the full height. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the alignment. So we're going to go grid, or so actually I don't even think we need, so it's just align items, and we're going to go center, and that should fix some of those alignment issues. Yeah, so now submit is like not expanding the full height, and it's just like it's native, natural, and it's centered. So the next thing I guess we want to style HD reaction, right? So let's style those emojis. So what we want to give it some padding. We don't need to give it a lot of, let's just give it, I don't know, a 10 pixel padding. Let's also, okay, so let's give it a border, 1 pixel solid, but we're gonna make it a transparent border. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna go HDC reaction hover. And we're going to go border 1 pixel solid, and we'll go, I don't know, C. And I'll go over why I gave it a transparent border in a sec. So now we got some padding, so there's a bit nicer spacing. And when you mouse over, we get a border so that we know, we can easily see which one we're moused over. So this is the reason that I put in the transparent border, is because if I don't do that, when we mouse over, we're basically creating an extra border. So now when I mouse over, see how everything kind of moves over 2 pixels to the right of the selected one? The reason for that is because when I mouse over, I'm adding an extra pixel on the left and an extra pixel on the right that didn't previously exist there. So by having the border transparent, it's now kind of reserving the space for the border. It's just not rendering a color for it. And we also want to give a cursor pointer. That way users know that these emoticons are selectable, they're clickable. So now the next, so one thing, just to show you the responsiveness of what I mean, that see how the submit button always has it? The submit button's by far the most important interaction there. So we need to make sure that we always have that extra, that we have enough room for it. So let's actually style that submit button now, because the default is pretty ugly and unassuming. Let's do, so I mean, this is kind of where things get a little complicated, because we want to style the button, but we also want as much of the native styling to be inherited by your theme or your site as possible. The problem is, I have no idea if your theme already has buttons styled, or whether your theme uses a specific or special class to style buttons. I have no idea. So we're just going to style it ourselves for this. There are ways that you can kind of do the best kind of mismatch as you can, but for us, we're just going to style the button ourselves. So we'll do background. We'll give it the same padding as our inputs, which was what did, oh, so we went with 12 and 16, 12 pixels and 16 pixels, and we want to set the color to sort of white. And now we should have a button that doesn't completely look like ass. Oh, and we need to get rid of the border as well. Sorry. So let's give it a border none. So you see how it's got that kind of bezelment, and now it's just kind of like a flat. So there we go. This is pretty much the front end of the actual of the leave a reply form. This is the kind of standard CSS HTML kind of layout. I think it looks pretty good. I mean, I guess we could have maybe put reactions maybe in its own column up top or something like that, like above the leave a comments, the way kind of Discus does it. But I actually like it here on this bottom bar as well. I think it looks, you know, I think it's a really good, smart idea for the formatting. So now we get to do a bit of the fun part. We get to basically now do the JavaScript. So what do we actually need to do with JavaScript? So I guess we need to validate this. So we need to make sure that when you submit, we need to make sure that you actually have a comment written, that you've actually written an email. We need to validate the email to make sure that you didn't just go, you know, we need to make sure that it's actually formatted somewhat like an email would be formatted. And we want to make sure that, you know, you didn't just do spaces and allow that to submit. We want to make sure that, you know, you actually wrote content. So we want to make sure that, for instance, you know, for the comment, or, you know, maybe the comment should be a minimum 10 characters. Maybe your name should be a minimum 5 characters or something like that. So we don't do validation like that. We want to make sure that when you select an action, it actually visually shows the user that an action has been, that a reaction has been selected, and we want to somehow save that as a variable so that we can send that in the form when we submit. And we want to basically disable the form. We don't even want this to be able to submit until these 3 fields have been filled out. Reactions will make optional, sorry. So we'll kind of do it in that way. I think it could work pretty good. So we need to kind of figure out what we want to do first. I guess the first thing we want to do is we want to kind of outline our elements. We want to get our elements set up so that we can easily reference them in vanilla JavaScript. So let's do that first. So now we're going to head over to our script file. So the first thing we want to do is we want to, well, the elements are never going to change. An element's an element. Like the submit button's always going to be the submit button. We're not changing, we're going to change attributes and stats of it, but we're never going to change the reference to it. So we can actually store these in a constant. Something I like to do, I mean, not every programmer likes to do it this way. I'm sure some people think it's a great idea, other people might think it's a terrible idea, but this is what I like. I like to kind of put, I like to kind of put all of my elements, when I reference them, inside an object. So we'll call it HDCEL. That'll be the name of our object. So what do we need first? We need the submit button. So we need the submit button. We need the comment button. Sorry, we need the email button. So the email text, like input text area, the name text area, and we need the reactions. And we need to reference all the reactions, not just the selected one. So the way that you do a selection in vanilla JavaScript is a little annoying. Like in jQuery, you just do something like this. You just do, you know, boom, you selected it, right? JavaScript, it's a bit more annoying. You basically got to go document.get elements by ID, and then the ID. So it's actually camel cased as well. I was expecting it to autofill, but I guess because I had the comma here, it didn't autofill. And then the ID. So what do we name it? We named it HDC submit, right? Let's verify that. Yeah, HDC submit. And then our email is, actually the comment is the first, right? Yeah, so HDC comment input. HDC email input is what we called it, right? Name input. And now we're going to change it up a bit. So we're going to go documents.get elements by class name. And this is going to basically be an array. It's going to end up storing as an array. And we named it, oh, just HDC reaction. So I don't think, at least not at this point, I don't think we need anything else here. So I'm actually getting an error here. What did I screw up? I screwed something up. So I'm getting a lint error. Oh, that's embarrassing. Equals. That's super embarrassing. Okay, there we go. So now basically we can reference any of our elements. So if we ever want to reference the submit button, we can just go HDC el.submit, and we now have access to that element. So now the next thing we want is we want to, what is the next thing we want? I guess what we want to do is we want to visually show when we're allowed to submit. So right now the submit button is filled in, as far as the user, the design, the flow is concerned. You can submit this right now. So what we want to do is we want to make this, we want to disable this. So I don't know if you can really see it, but when I click it, see how it's got the focus border, the blue border that is default in Chrome. So what we actually going to do is we're going to disable it. So we're going to disable that button. So now it doesn't look any different, but you'll notice I'm clicking it, but we're no longer getting that focus because it's disabled. So we can no longer click this button. So what we need to do is we need to actually show that. So let's go back to our CSS style sheet and let's actually give it like an opacity of like, I don't know, 0.4, something really low so that it looks kind of, yeah, see now it looks grayed out. It looks like it's disabled. And what we'll do is once we kind of type stuff and validate the information and validate that we're able to submit, we'll give it a new class called, I don't know, enabled. And we'll remove that opacity, give it a 100% opacity. That way the user can visually see, oh, I'm allowed to submit now. So we'll create a class. So we'll call it HDC submit enabled, and we'll give it an opacity of 1. So that's the only change. Once the button's enabled, we add that class and it'll now have that opacity. So let's go back to the script. So what we need to do is we need like an on key up event. That way we can kind of validate every time the user presses a button, we can then validate the fields and see whether we should enable or disable the submit button. So what we'll do is we'll create a new function. We'll call function HDC can submit. Sure, why not? So this is the function HDC can submit, and every time this function runs, we'll check the required fields. So now what we need to do is we need to figure out when to run this function. And to do that, we're going to basically need to do something called event listeners. So let's create a new function called HDC set event listeners. You know what? Just for here's the thing. Can submit is basically like a Boolean. Like it's my own like little personal coding standard. It's because this function is basically it basically acts as a Boolean. Can we submit? Yes or no, true or false. I always like to do Booleans as kind of like can submit, can something, is something. You know, you kind of write it as that kind of thing. But it's for the sake of keeping the kind of same naming conventions. I will still name it can submit, but I'll just do it as an underscore just to make things a bit easier to follow. So here's a function called HDC set event listeners, and here's where we'll set listeners. So basically the site will check, we'll basically create an action. So like anytime a certain action is performed, we'll run a function. And the action we want is we want to add an event listener for key up. So what we'll do is we'll do, so now we can start targeting those, this constant here, the object constant. So we go HDC underscore EL dot comment, dot add event listener, and that's the event listener. So the way the event listener works, it's kind of like the first parameter is action, and the second parameter is the function that you want to run when that action occurs. So our action is going to be key up. So every time the key you're typing and the key goes up, we're going to run the function, and the function we're running is HDC can submit. So we're going to want to do that for the comment, the email, and the name. So what this means is now every single time you type something in here, here, or here, this function is going to fire off. But first we need to actually invoke this function. So let's actually get that function running as soon as the file is loaded. So now that we have our event listeners, we can actually start doing stuff inside of here. So what we want to do is we want to get the value of each of these. So we'll call let comment equal HDC el dot comment dot value dot not node value, just dot value dot trim. And there's the reason we're using trim is because basically what we're doing right now is we're first just going to check, does this input even have content? Is there even any content here? But we want to basically make sure that the content isn't just an empty or blank space. We want to make sure it's content of substance. So the first thing we're doing is we're checking, we're storing the values inside of variables. So we're going to want to do that for comments, and we're going to want to do it for the email and name. Great. No, that's not supposed to be it. Sorry. Great. So now we have variables storing the data that are trimmed. So now what we need to do is we need to check, okay, do all three of these have data, right? Do all three of these have data? So we're going to go if comment does not equal blank and email does not equal empty blank, and name does not equal blank, then continue. And you know what? There's actually a better way to do this. Let's actually there's actually a much better way to do this. So instead of checking for blank, because we've already trimmed, we can actually go dot length. Dot length is greater than let's go with 4. So what this now means is we're now checking to make sure that the comment is greater than 4, the email is greater than 4, and the name is greater than 4. So we're not checking to make sure that that it has content, that the content isn't blank because we're trimming it. We're making sure that the content actually has a value that's somewhat reasonable. So if this happens, then we can do something. And if this doesn't happen, then we can do something else. So what we need to do is we need to determine what that something is. So if this succeeds, that essentially means there's still some more validating we need to do. So for instance, we'll need to validate the email. But basically what this means is that, for now, let's just assume that if these parameters are true, then we'll want to basically enable the submit button. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add a class list. We're going to want to add a class list to the submit button to enable it. The class was, what did we call it? We called it HDC submit enabled. So we're going to want to add that class. So we're going to go HDC el dot submit. Why do I always write submit? Dot submit dot classlist dot add. Boom. So if these things happen, we're going to want to add that class. if it doesn't happen, then we're going to want to remove that class, right? Because you could start typing something in one box, have everything fill out, but then you can maybe go and delete another box before you submit. So we need to also do the reverse to make sure that if it doesn't follow through, we need to undo the enable. We also, remember, we actually started the actual submit button itself disabled. It's not actually clickable. So we also want to remove that parameter of disabling it. So the way we do that is, I actually not really remember how we do it. How do we do it? I think it's just something, I actually don't remember how to do that. Like you would think it would be like a get attribute, but it's not. Dot submit. I think it might be something like disabled equals false. I think it might be something like that. Let's add a console log there. So let's actually test this out. So right now we're disabled. Let's check out the console log. Can't of null on 25. So where did I screw up here? 25. So it's saying that it can't find, it's saying it can't find HDCEL.comment. So do I have the wrong input? No, it's the right input. So why isn't this working here? What am I screwed something up. What is it? Let's just test to see whether it's all of them or just yeah, so it's doing it to all of them. That's interesting. Let's do a quick test here. I know I'm obviously missing something stupid. So let's actually output the constant and see whether there's any nodes in there. Okay, so all of the nodes are null, except for reactions. So it looks like the problem is oh wait. So it must be, I must have screwed up this. Document dot get element by ID, right? Oh, I'm an idiot. Okay, I see the problem. This is okay, guys. This is a really stupid. So I'm not supposed to have the hashtag here, the $sign. That's, see, I was in jQuery mode and I select, so sorry, yeah, because it already targeting the ID, you're not supposed to put the hashtag in. So I'm sorry about that. That was stupid. That was on me. So now it should work. Except it's not. Parameter 2 is not an object. Why am I making... Oh, another really stupid problem. Sorry guys, all of a sudden I record myself and I make the most amateur mistakes possible. Yeah, so that's not supposed to be in quotes, you just call the function. So that's, oh my god, that's embarrassing. Okay, we got this really simple thing working now. So basically, this shouldn't work. If I do AA, it won't work. If I do that, it won't work. If I do this, it won't work. And the reason it's not working is because this isn't 5 characters. Remember, we check to make sure it's over 4 characters. So no, no, and it's enabled. So it says good to go, which means we made it this far. But you'll notice something still didn't work right. So I have no idea whether Okay, so the enabled worked. So it enabled that. That worked. But you notice that it didn't change the opacity. So I see here. So it did add the class, and it tried to set opacity as 1, but the default overrode it. So why did the default overrode it? Did I not have it high enough? Okay, I see. But you know what? Let's just for the sake of time, let's just give this an important, which is something you really shouldn't do. I should probably rearrange these so that the priority changes, but you know, let's just simple that. There we go. So as you can see, it actually enabled, and if I do, it disables again. But we didn't actually disable the submit button, so we need to disable the submit button on that as well, which should be as simple as true. Should be as simple as that. Right? And that's clickable. And okay, it's disabled again. Perfect. So that's now working. One thing you might have noticed is that despite having field inputs here, I haven't actually wrapped them inside a form. And the reason for that is because we're kind of cheating. One of the things that we're doing to help avoid spam and bots from targeting this form is by not actually having a form. A lot of automated spam bots, they first check for forms that they can submit to. The fact that these inputs aren't actually in a form reduces the chances of them even attempting to submit it. And we're going to be basically using Ajax to submit it instead of submitting the form directly anyways. So there isn't really the advantages of actually using a form. I personally feel just don't outweigh the disadvantages at this point, which is why even though the button may be enabled, when I click submit, it's not actually trying to submit a form because a form doesn't exist. So one thing we want to do is we also want to validate this email, because right now this shouldn't validate. It's not an email address. It should be forced to look like that, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to once again do a little tiny cheat, and we're going to go back to one of my other plugins. So for instance, HD Forms is a WordPress plugin I have, and we're going to steal some JavaScript I already wrote to validate emails. So I don't remember what I called the function. So I called it HDF validate email address. So so here's the function. So we're going to steal this function from HD forms, and you're going to see why. So this is what the function looks like. As you can see, this isn't something I could have just written offhand here on a live video, but basically this uses a regular expression to parse the email and return a Boolean. So this accepts an email address, parses it, validates it with regex, uses a test, and returns a Boolean either true or false. If it's true, it validates, it's a valid email. If it returns false, it's not a valid email address. So one thing we want to do is, once again, up here in our can submit, once we verify that yes, there's data, we also want to validate the email address. So we're going to wrap this inside of there, and we're going to do, we'll do another else. Should probably put this inside its own function just to be a bit more, you know, to abstract a bit more, but for the sake of this video, we're just going to do two else's that repeat the same code. So now we should have a working email address. So this will not validate. Good. See how it's not validating despite having content? Now this also shouldn't validate because it recognizes this as not a real email address because I got these special characters. But as soon as I do this, boom, validated. If I were to get rid of the @ symbol, unlocks again. So we now actually have some decent front-end JavaScript form validation here. And as you can see, it's done in vanilla JavaScript. And guys, this isn't a lot of code. This is pretty small and bare bone code, vanilla JavaScript. Pretty simple if you don't make stupid mistakes like putting a hashtag where you're not supposed to have one because, you know, you haven't really had your coffee I mean, it's been sitting here getting cold for the entire video, and I haven't been drinking it because I've been talking. So, I mean, it's pretty easy. We don't need React. We don't need to manage all those states. We don't need jQuery to do DOM manipulation and get field values. We can do it very easily with just classic JavaScript. And it's a much smaller file size since we're not importing all these additional libraries as well. So probably the next thing we need now is to be able to select these reactions. So remember this here in the object, because we're not doing IDs, basically this will return more than one element. So it'll return an array. If you do get elements by class name and there only happens to be one element with that class name, it'll still return an array. It's just it'll have an array of only one value. So what we're going to do is we're going to also want to set event listeners. But we're going to want to set an event listener for every single reaction in the array. So we're going to do a for loop. We're going to go for let I equals 0 while I is less than HDCEL dot reactions dot length I plus plus. So basically, however many reactions we are, it's going to take that total and it's going to loop that many times. So now we can do another event listener. So we're going to go reaction I, which is how far into the loop we are. And instead of key up, we're doing click. We're going to do it on click. So this is now going to create a new event listener for every single reaction. So this will work independently. I could add another 20 emojis and we wouldn't need to modify our JavaScript at all. It'll still work. What we do need though is we need to, we don't want to validate the can submit. What we're doing, we want a new function. So HDC select emoji. You know what? Let's add another variable here. So let's actually do two more variables. Let can submit equal false. Let reaction equal null. And I'll get into why I decided to put in a can submit boolean. But what we want to do is we want to basically toggle this. So here we want to do can submit equals true, and then both here and both the falses, we want to disable the can. This way, when we actually click the submit button, we want to first check, is this true or false? If it's true, continue. If it's false, just don't do anything. And that is for security, because right now this is disabled, but I could always modify this. I could always just modify the DOM. Boom. Now it's clickable again, right? So the fact that we're adding that extra check into the JavaScript directly is just an extra layer of validation, an extra little layer of security. So now let's actually create this function. So basically the element we click is going to be the element that we're going to want to add a custom class to. So just like how we had this custom class, we also want a custom class for the reaction. So let's do HD reaction selected. It will give it a border 1 pixel solid. Let's make it darker. So instead of C, let's do, I don't know, 9. Give it a slightly darker gray. So we'll add this class to whatever element we select. So I guess the first thing we want to do is we want to get the value of the element. So we're going to want to store so we're going to want to store that value in the variable reaction. So we currently set reaction to null. So by default, reaction is going to be null. But if you select a reaction, by the way, I should probably actually consistently call these reactions instead of emojis. So if you actually select a reaction, then we want to store the value of that reaction. So what we're going to do is we're going to want to go this, which will automatically, I was accidentally typing this. So reaction equals this dot get attributes. And I believe I called it data reaction. So there we go. So now reaction will contain the value of the selected reaction. So now what we want to do is we want to add the class. So we want to go this dot, this dot class list dot add. We want to add the name of that of the new class we selected. So there we go. So what we're doing is we're storing the value of the reaction in a variable, and we're adding the class HD reaction select. Now the problem is, what happens if you change your mind? I select happy. Oh, I changed my mind. I want to click sad. The problem is we're not actually removing that class list. So to show you how that would look. So boom, boom. Why isn't this working? Cannot read property 0 on line 45. What did I screw up this time, guys? Oh, I see. It's supposed to be called reactions, and I only had it as reactions. That's that's like what, stupid mistake number 5? There we go. So as you can see, it's keeping the class. I mean, it'll be updating the value correctly, but it's not removing the class of the previously selected reaction. So we need to, before we add ours, we need to actually remove whichever one is already existing. So let's go on let prev, which will just stand for previous, that previously selected action equal documents dot get elements by class name, and we're going to search for an element with that class name. The problem is what if this is the first time we've selected? If this is the first time we selected, then this is going to basically return null. There isn't going to be one. So now what we need to do is we need to go if prev. So only if prev exists are we going to go prev.classlist.remove HDC reaction. If I didn't have this if prev, then basically if this was the first one we selected, it would try to remove something from something that doesn't exist, and it would give us an error. So first we need to, so that's why we have it wrapped in an if statement to test it. So now this should work. Remove undefined. Wait, on what, line 39? Oh, I already mentioned to you the reason why. I told you that basically the get elements by class names is always an array. So I need to set it as target the first element in the array, and they'll only be one, or at least they should only be one. There we go. Ah, haha, now it's working. So that's stupid mistake number 6 I made. Okay. So we're now storing that state. So now the next thing to do is actually figure out what to do once we submit.